I'd like to welcome and thank everyone for joining today's globalFACT Forum Live HVACR Regulatory Update webinar. My name is Jordan Smith, and I serve as Executive Director of the Global Forum for Advanced Climate Technologies, known as globalFACT. Our organization promotes education, awareness, and policies that support the important role of new generation, low and reduced global warming potential advanced climate technologies in protecting the environment while meeting the rapidly increasing demand for safe alternatives. Today's webinar is an important addition to the information and programming that globalFACT has been providing to users, policymakers, and the public since our launch last year. We invite you to visit our website at globalFACT.org to learn more about our organization's recent activities. I am happy to be joined today by our guest presenter, Helen Walter-Terrinoni, Vice President of Regulatory Affairs at the Air Conditioning, Heating, and Refrigeration Institute. Helen has a broad background in industry with a deep experience in critical regulatory issues. She began working for DuPont in 1995 in the titanium technologies business and spent 7 years managing the fluorochemicals foam expansion agent business and development program, including manufacturing plant design. She holds a master's degree in chemical engineering with a concentration in environmental engineering from Syracuse University. Helen worked on regulatory issues with the Center for Polyurethane Institute and other associations. She's the co-chair of the UN Montreal Protocol Foams Technical Options Committee and has served as science advisor for the Alliance for Responsible Atmospheric Policy, as well as on the board for the Association of Home Appliance Manufacturers. A reminder that this webinar and related materials are for information purposes only and not for the purpose of providing legal advice. If you need legal guidance on a particular matter, you should contact your attorney. Finally, if you have any questions for Helen, you can share them via the webinar's chat feature or by emailing them to questions@globalfact.org. We'll have a Q&A period following her presentation. And with that, I will turn it over to Helen.
Jordan, thank you very much. It's great to see you again today. Welcome to this discussion around the changing world of refrigerant regulations. As you know, there's quite a bit going on in this space, and there's a significant amount of information to discuss here today. First, we kind of talk to you about some background regarding the world and the goals of the world. The Kigali Agreement, as you may know, is an HFC agreement regarding a phase down of HFCs globally under the Montreal Protocol. The global goal is to limit temperature rise for climate change purposes to between 1.5 and 2 degrees Celsius. This half-degree difference would result in the consequences of 250 million more people being exposed to drought and the consequences of drought, and 1.17 billion more people exposed to extreme temperatures. 1.7 billion more people exposed to extreme temperatures, which is about a fifth of the current global population. The design of the HFC phase down, the thinking is that would reduce temperature rise by up to 0.5 degree Celsius. And this weighted phase down of the consumption and production of controlled HFCs by country has the construct that each country would determine their own regulatory structure, for example, quota or allocations or bans or GWP limits. And these regulatory structures are starting to emerge. Here's a little bit of a history lesson. I could go back even further. Before the year 2000, the Kyoto Protocol actually included HFCs. As you may know, the European Union has been regulating HFCs since 2006 under the F-gas or fluorinated gas rules. The first rule regulated aerosols in mobile air conditioning and some foams. The second rule, which was implemented in 2014, is an overall phase down, 79% reduction by 2030. Australia had an HFC tax in 2012. Which was quite large tax, about $20 per pound of 404A or $10 per pound of 410A. It was repealed in 2014. However, it has had a significant impact on advancing that phase down in Australia at a very quick pace. For those of you who may not be aware, Senate Bill 1383 in California statutorily requires a 40% reduction in emissions by 2030 for California compared to 2013. This is by far one of the most ambitious goals globally, and we'll talk a little bit more about that as we move on. In Japan, the Top Runner program was initiated in 2015, and in 2016 and 17 in the U.S., the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, issued SNAP rules, Significant New Alternative Policy Program, SNAP rules 20 and 21, and we'll talk some more about those as well. We'll talk about the Climate Alliance states as well and what they're doing around adoption of SNAP rules. In further discussion, more detail about the Montreal Protocol, there's a graphic here that kind of shows the phase down. The earliest transitioners are meant to be the what's called the 9 Article 5 or developed country parties. And 79 countries as of August 2019 have ratified the Kigali Amendment to the Montreal Protocol, including European Union, Canada, Japan, and Australia, and Mexico, and many, many others. As industry and environmental NGOs, we have agreed that a universal system under the Montreal Protocol was best. It provides a predictable transition that we're accustomed to. It's a gradual slope over a 20-year period. And the input that has been encouraged by the parties to the Montreal Protocol has been one that has been very able to adjust for practical matters. So there have been inclusions of exemptions where solutions are not available, as well as addressing other practical concerns. So as industry, we've always thought that this was the best path forward from a transition perspective, especially as we see the world moving forward. This global phase-down approach has been very desirable. So what about the United States? The United States has not yet ratified the HFC amendment to the Montreal Protocol. The process would be that the State Department would be directed by the White House and transmit the amendment for advice and consent to the Senate. 2/3 of senators present must vote in favor, and then the EPA would create regulations to implement the amendment. They could use the tools in the toolbox that they've used in previous transitions for ozone-depleting substances, such as sector-based controls like they had in the SNAP rules 20 and 21, a quota and allocation system like was used with HCFCs, so the ozone-depleting substances, especially HCFC 22. Or they could use sector-based GWP limits like Canada and other countries are using, or some combination thereof. I think the thinking was that SNAP Rule 20 and 21 and the Refrigerant Management HFC rules were designed to meet the first 2 steps of the phase-down. So the first step is a 10% drop compared to the baseline years of 2013 to 15. And it was designed to start in 2019 and then a 40% drop in 2024, following on in 5-year increments until the last step. So those first steps were meant to be addressed largely by those SNAP rules. As you may know, those rules were challenged under legally, and so those are no longer in play. They have been vacated by the court to the extent that they required HFC to be replaced in existing applications. The EPA is still determining how they will regulate HFCs going forward. The rules have been remanded back to EPA for them to be rewritten in compliance with the court's decision. We've been told that the goal was for them to be published, a proposed rule to be published later this year. There's a lot to think about as we contemplate how this will be addressed for EPA, and we know that they're still working through that. Certainly our hope is to see that sooner rather than later, but we'll have to see if that gets done in 2019 or perhaps early 2020. For those of you who are not familiar, the EPA SNAP rules were basically the non-allowance of the further use of different fluids in different market sectors. So you can see these commercial refrigeration sectors listed here, including larger systems as well as smaller systems for higher GWP fluids like R404A, as well as in some other air conditioning and other uses, as noted here, for centrifugal chillers of particular interest in 2024. Although we don't know how the EPA will regulate HFCs going forward, I think that these sectors are very important as we think about states and what they're doing in adopting transition dates based on the SNAP program, the Significant New Alternatives Policy Program. For those of you who do not know, the U.S. in 2017 submitted a formal statement saying that they would withdraw from the Paris Climate Agreement at the earliest date, which is November 4th, 2020, after the next presidential election. At that time, 3 states came together. Washington State, New York, and California came together, and they committed, the governors of those states committed that they would meet the Paris climate goals for their states. Since that time, 25 governors have signed on, so 24 states and Puerto Rico are now moving forward with climate regulations due to federal inaction. So the U.S. Climate Alliance states, out of those states, approximately 8 have stated that they will address HFCs in the transition. Just for reference, 65 countries under the Paris Agreement in their individual nationally determined contributions, their INDCs, had stated that they will use HFC phase down or phase out as a tool to address climate change. And here's some information about some of those states. California, Washington, and Vermont have all adopted HFC transitions based on the SNAP rules with some delays and exceptions. So, for example, products that were slated to transition by 2017 were given an extension to 2019 for Washington and California. Other states, Connecticut, Maryland, Delaware, and New York, have all made commitments to take steps to regulate HFCs under their current legislative authority, and we expect to see those final regulations very soon. New Jersey has introduced legislation based on the SNAP rules, mirroring what Washington State included in their legislation, and we anticipate that there will be more activity in the states as we move forward. As the states view HFC transitions as a low-cost way from a carbon perspective to address climate change. I said that we would get back to California. So California has one of the most ambitious goals in the world, and the reason for that is that they regulate. They've been told to regulate based on emissions rather on production and consumption. That difference means that during the lifetime of the product, that California will be looking at those emissions rather than just what's introduced as a new fluid. And so that puts California's goals at 5 to 10 years ahead of the Kigali Agreement due to the lifetime of equipment. And those emissions are measured in the LA Basin, and that's how they determine that. And they'll be comparing that to the 2013 measurements that they took. Because of their more ambitious goals, California has added proposed regulations beyond the scope of the SNAP rules that some of the other states have adopted. On the next chart, we'll be discussing that. So out of the 40% reduction, they believe that 10% would come from the SNAP rules, 10% they said would come from the Kigali phase down, and 20% from additional measures. Some of the additional measures that they've been contemplating are a 750 global warming potential, or GWP, limit for air conditioning systems starting January 1st, 2023 for a new manufacture date. And for new commercial refrigeration systems, their proposal is a 150 GWP limit in 2022, beginning in 2022. They also proposed a service band that would no longer allow the use of refrigerants for servicing above a 1,500 GWP with a 2022 date, with the potential exemptions that they would allow reclaimed refrigerants, and they would also allow the use of 410A for stationary air conditioning. They have stated a number of times that they don't want to strand existing equipment without a refrigerant to be used, so they don't want to make that equipment obsolete. But the bottom line is these emissions goals are driving regulations beyond the SNAP rules and beyond the refrigerant management rules, which California has also adopted. These additional commercial refrigeration and AC measures are designed to help support them reaching that goal. As I noted earlier, implementation does vary by country under the Montreal Protocol. So, and this is just kind of showing the different ways that different countries have managed this. And this also may lend itself to what we might see in states in combinations as we move forward. But the European Union combined an allocation system or a quota system with global warming potential or GWP limits by sector, as did Canada. Australia has a GWP step down every 2 years, unlike the Montreal Protocol, which is generally a 5-year step, and they have no sector-based bans or GWP limits at this time. They do charge a deposit for HFCs to encourage their recovery and reclamation at the end of life. Japan kind of has the whole suite. They've got GWP limits by sector, they've got reclaim requirements, and a quota and allocation phase down. Regardless of the country, there is a challenge around leaking equipment, and we'll talk about that a little bit further here. According to the United Nations Environment Program, the leaking stationary refrigeration and air conditioning equipment constitutes about 52% of the total GWP that's used globally. So about 86% of GWP is used for refrigeration, air conditioning, and heat pumps. And out of that 86%, 60% of it is used to top up leaks. That's how we come up with that 52%. So you can see that you can't get to a bottom line goal of being at 15% or 20% of your baseline without addressing leaking equipment. And that's going to be a really important feature going forward. And as an industry, we're going to have to work with end users to understand how to address that issue. The European Union fluorinated gas regulations, although California has the most ambitious goals, European Union is already implementing goals that are more ambitious than the Montreal Protocol HFC phase down, the Kigali Amendment. This orange line shown here is is a caricature showing the phase down underneath the Montreal Protocol. The purple line shows the earlier requirements of the European Union under their phase down. They're similar, but they have different baselines, and the scope and the phase down steps are slightly different. And the F-gas rules will address most of the needed phase down under the Montreal Protocol. So you can see that a major step has already been taken in 2018, the first step down under the European Union. The European Union also has equipment bans. So you can see here this list of equipment bans by type. For example, there's a 2020 ban on stationary refrigeration and movable air conditioners with GWPs above the limits noted here of 2,500 and 150. That is after, however, the big step that they had in 2018, and that has created some creative thinking, perhaps, in how folks have transitioned. It has not been as prescriptive in these early years before the big steps, and it will become more prescriptive later on, as you see here. They do have as well a 2020 a service ban above a 2,500 GWP limit, so that will be in place at that time as well. I mentioned Canada earlier as well, and Canada also has a combination similar to the European Union. They do have the quota and allocation system as well as global warming potential limits, GWP limits, as noted here. So, for example, in 2020, standalone medium temperature commercial refrigeration system have a limit of 1,400, and low temperature systems have a 1,500 GWP limit. You can see the rest here on the chart. And they have combined that with the consumption and production limits and allowances there. In Australia, I mentioned earlier that they have a 2-year step phase down. So they are approaching a more gradual transition pattern where at this time, they don't have any sector-specific bans or GWP limits in place. However, they may consider that in the future if they feel like they are approaching the cap, the allocation cap. So the step downs every 2 years are designed to try to avoid shocks to the system, to the industry, which are typically observed having longer time periods between the transitions. I just would note Japan here again. They've got something called the Act on Rational Use and Proper Management of Fluorocarbons, where they have had these GWP limits in place for a number of years, a little bit earlier than maybe some of the other countries. They were kind of thinking ahead, and they have implemented their quota and allocation system, and they do have requirements around reclaim as well. The last country I'll mention here is that even the developing world, so even the Article 5 parties to the Montreal Protocol, are considering options and analyzing how they will implement the phase down as well. So this is an ever-changing landscape. I would mention here, Jordan, that even Quebec province in Canada has just as recently as July 17th come out with draft regulations that would further regulate beyond the scope of the national regulations in Canada. And we may expect to see more of this as we move forward. And I think it's important for us to all continue talking about this as a very important topic that affects all of these companies. Next, I just wanted to turn our attention to the transition and some practical matters associated with it. We talked a little bit about Australia and their carbon tax earlier. They had the carbon tax in place for a few years. It was repealed after a few years. However, as of 2018, over half of the air conditioning equipment sold uses an A2L or a lower flammability refrigerant, an R32 refrigerant. The industry came together very quickly when the carbon tax was in place and worked together to do an end-to-end supply chain analysis, basically trying to ensure that they had a safe transition in place and they were well prepared for it. Since that time, they now have, like I said, over half of the AC equipment sold in Australia contains an A2L or a lower flammability refrigerant. And 460 models, including 35 larger ducted systems. You have to have a license to purchase any HFC. You don't have to have a license to purchase hydrocarbons. And this is part of what was implemented as the safe transition. There have been no reports of safety issues related to the use of R32 in Australia, but since 2014, there have been some very serious incidents related to hydrocarbons and their use of them. As we started thinking at AHRI, the Air Conditioning, Heating, and Refrigeration Institute, about how to transition in this country, obviously we wanted to do this in a safe way. Our board approved this Safe Refrigerant Transition Task Force to assist us in an analysis of the end-to-end supply chain because some of the properties of low global warming potential refrigerants, for example, flammability and toxicity, may require changes in the way that we do things from a design perspective as well as from an implementation, so installation, design, operation and maintenance, and then how we handle things at end of life to minimize risk while we meet the climate commitments that the companies have made as well as the regulations. Some of these have been historic products that we expect to see more use of, and even in larger charge sizes such as hydrocarbons and ammonia. And then some of them are new products with lower flammability, as I mentioned before, the A2Ls. But regardless of the product, we're looking at this and we're working very hard on this. And we'd like to invite any interested stakeholder to participate in this work. And we have initially a North America focus, but then we will socialize these learnings internationally, including looking at historic incidents related to refrigerants as a very important feature of understanding root cause to prevent these going forward. So if you're interested, if you would like to contact at the email there, we'd love to have your participation. Finally, we've just got contact information here, Jordan, for folks in case they'd like to get in touch with you or me and get involved in any of these things. So thank you very much. Appreciate your time. And I think that we'll probably be moving shortly here to some questions.
We will. Thank you, Helen. Thank you so much. You covered a lot of information on what is a landscape that's changing very quickly. So I know that what you probably reported today may be different a week or a month from now. So
or
we
tomorrow.
appreciate that. So we're just going to remind folks that if you'd like to submit a question, please do so by emailing at questions@globalfact.org. And we're going to take a moment and pull those together.
So while we're looking through the questions, Jordan, I did want to add a little bit more color and information about the regulations in Quebec. There is a comment period through August 31st for Quebec, and if folks are interested in learning how to contact the government of Quebec and participating in that discussion, we're happy to help them connect to that. Like I said, I may have mentioned earlier, they are talking about a 1,500 GWP limit in 2021 for air conditioning equipment. And it's written up in a way that it actually says an HFC ban in 2021 for commercial refrigeration equipment. I'm not sure if that's an error or not, but we have a phone call into the folks in Quebec and a request for a meeting with them to have further discussion there.
Terrific. So we are going to turn to a couple of questions now. I just want to remind folks that the webinar and related materials are for information purposes only and not for the purpose of providing legal advice. And if you are looking for legal advice, you should contact one of the many attorneys who I'm sure are out there interested in assisting. So our first question, Helen, is what's a bigger driver of GHG emissions, direct or indirect?
So that's a great question. I think this question kind of asks as well more generally. It kind of falls in the category of why the heck are we regulating HFCs, right? Because energy efficiency is a very, very important feature here. And so as this person notes by this question, that energy efficiency is very important when we think about carbon footprint, CO2 emissions, and the footprint from a climate perspective. So in the long term, the CO2 lasts in the atmosphere from 500 to 1,000 years. A third of man-made CO2 is kind of hanging around the anthropogenic CO2. In the short term, however, the larger impact is from short-lived climate pollutants, or SLCPs. Are looked at as a way to very quickly take a quick hit against climate change and address these issues quickly. So when we talk about short-lived climate pollutants, or SLCPs, we're talking about methane, black carbon, but also HFCs, so also fluorocarbons. And so those have been tagged as a way to very quickly address climate as fast as we can with some very high GWP refrigerants and move them to something with a lower climate impact.
Terrific. I'm just going to remind folks that you can submit questions either through the webinar's chat feature or by emailing them to questions@globalFACT.org. Next question I have here, how can I reduce my carbon footprint without installing a new system?
I don't know who sent this question, but I love this person. This is a wonderful question, and it's a very, very important one. The first thing that could be done would be to make sure that equipment is properly serviced, and that any leaks in the system have been addressed. So if you have a service technician coming by to look at your AC system, you want to make sure that they are checking for leaks and that they are addressing any leaks and then checking for leaks again before they leave your home or your business. And the reason for that is twofold. We talked about direct and indirect emissions, and let me explain that a little bit further. Direct emissions happen when a refrigerant leaks right out of the system, and so you've got the global warming potential of the refrigerant impacting the world. The indirect emissions are from energy efficiency, so that's the kind of the secondary emissions that we see from an air conditioning system. Fixing leaky systems and making sure that they're well maintained addresses both, and so you get a benefit from both things. It's been estimated that up to 70% of energy efficiency problems come from poorly maintained systems or poorly designed and installed systems. And so this impacts a reduction of those direct emissions by reducing those leaks directly, but also making sure that your system is going to run properly so that you impact those indirect emissions too. And so thank you very much for that question.
Terrific. Our next question. I use an HFO blend. Is that an okay option for the short term given regulations?
Absolutely. Certainly, the regulations that you see either are bans on higher GWP blends or neat refrigerants, or they are GWP limits around the world. And so certainly anything that fits there is a good fit for the regulations. I think longer term, some of the things we're going to have to grapple with as an industry and as downstream folks is, can we recover these refrigerants and reuse them? So if it's an HFO blend, for those of you who are less aware of that, that's an HFC combined with a very low GWP refrigerant. And so the combination of the two reduces that GWP significantly. I think we'll have to look at if we can recover the HFC out of that blend and reuse it so that we continue to use these blends going forward.
Terrific. We're going to check and see if we have any further questions.
Mm-hmm. In the meantime, Jordan, while we wait, I would just mention again the Safe Refrigerant Transition Task Force. We can talk a little bit more about that. I think we've got some more questions here now.
Yep. So our next question, do regulators care that I've invested in other methods of reducing my carbon emissions, or do they regulate GWP?
It depends on the regulator. If we think about California, for example, they have a statutory legal requirement to reduce global warming potential, these short-lived climate pollutant emissions. And so, yes, I think they would say yes to both. Yes, they want you to reduce your energy consumption. They want you to reduce your indirect emissions. They also want you to reduce your GWP consumption, your HFC consumption and your HFC emissions.
Terrific. Our next question, what consideration is being given to how the refrigerant changes affect equipment efficiency and related energy demand?
That's a great question. I love these. These are really good questions, folks. That's a really good question. The UN has published a series of papers, hundreds of pages, examining the impact of the transition to low global warming potential refrigerants and the impact on energy efficiency. And the reason for that is in high ambient temperature countries, so places that it's really hot, so the Middle East or even some places in the United States that get really, really high temperatures. When the transition took place from HCFC 22 to R410A, there was an energy efficiency penalty that took place. And so not wanting that to occur again, the Montreal Protocol family spent time, they were directed by the parties, the technical folks were directed by the parties to examine this issue. What they found is that the impact of the refrigerant on the energy efficiency footprint was actually very small, less than 20%. And largely the answer is the impact is coming from equipment design, for example, compressor choice and so on, as well as what we mentioned earlier with the other great question of the proper design and installation and maintenance of equipment as having a very, very large impact on energy efficiency. And I guess while we're waiting for more questions, Jordan, maybe I could talk a little bit more about some of the things the Safe Refrigerant Transition Task Force has been working on. So one of the things we've done is we've gone back and looked at all the historical incidents that we could find to understand how they happened and why they happened. Obviously, since lower flammability refrigerants, or A2Ls, have not really been in play, these incidents were related to A1s or products that don't propagate a flame, like R22, as well as carbon dioxide, hydrocarbons, and ammonia. And what we found largely was that there were challenges around making sure that when a piece of equipment is designated as needing to be replaced, that it is replaced. So we found that some equipment was running for 5 years more after it had been identified as needing replacement. Another big feature there is that we found that folks understanding the limits associated with refrigerants. So, for example, all refrigerants are listed through AHRI. So AHRI is the American Society of Heating, Refrigeration, and Air Conditioning Engineers. All those refrigerants are listed through AHRI, and they have a refrigerant concentration limit. So there's a limit to how much refrigerant is allowed into a room from a safety perspective, either toxicity or flammability. And we found that there was a poor understanding of that. And so I think it's important to mention that here as we take a minute and are waiting for a couple more questions from folks. That as we think about this safe transition, that's one of the things we need to think about. And we needed to think about it more, apparently, even with the historic products that were in use, because there were some pretty serious incidents that happened with those. I think we've got more questions coming.
So, Helen, our next question, what trends are emerging as industry-leading ways to reduce GWP?
So I think there has been amazing work done by the equipment manufacturers and refrigerant producers in the design of of new products and blends. There was a study done by NIST, the National Institute for Science and Technology, did a study looking at all the refrigerants that they could think of to see if they could come up with any new refrigerant combinations that industry had not come together and developed. And what they found is that that folks have done a very, very thorough job, and they've actually found what the NIST believes is all the building blocks that will be available. I'm sure there will be more combinations coming forward, but folks have done a very good job there. I think as well, the folks designing equipment have done terrific work, whether it's compressor design or total system design, looking at ways that these things can be combined together. I think microchannels allow for lower refrigerant charging of systems, better energy efficiency and other features, more leak-tight systems. A lot of really, really great work has been done on this front, and I commend all the folks working really hard out there in industry that have done this work.
Terrific. Thank you. We're going to look and see if we have any final questions. I think we do have one more. And the question is, are codes and standards in place to facilitate installation of equipment implementing low GWP refrigerants? So
that's a terrific question. So let me start with commercial refrigeration because I suspect that a lot of folks here are involved in commercial refrigeration. So on the commercial refrigeration side, the International Electrical Classification, so the IEC standard, was just completed to allow larger charge sizes of lower GWP refrigerants. So whether it's an A2L, so a lower flammability product, or an A3, a higher flammability product, that work was just completed internationally. The next step is for a harmonization among North America kind of takes place. So United Laboratories, UL, has been asked by AHRI to initiate that process. It's called CANINA, so that's the harmonization process, to start a working group to develop the safety standards for the use of lower GWP refrigerants in commercial refrigeration equipment. So that work is just now getting started, and I think it's very, very important work. I think there are a lot of things that we have learned from the IEC standard development, as well as from the development of the air conditioning standards for air conditioning equipment in the home, as well as big chillers for commercial buildings that we'll be using to build from. There's also been over $7 million worth of testing that's been completed for the use of these A2Ls and A3 refrigerants in systems, these low GWP refrigerants to be used in systems. And I think that testing has been very important, and it's great that that's been done before the standards work has started. So that's kind of where commercial refrigeration sits. That standard needs to be completed, and then the next step would be to go through normal process would be to go through the model codes and then adoption or uptake by states and provinces in the U.S. and Canada. On the air conditioning side of things, on the chiller side, I guess I'll talk about them together since they're both impacted by the same standard. So UL 60335-2-40 is the safety standard for AC equipment, as well as for there's some linkages to chillers in that, as well as AHRI 15. And both the Edition 3 is just now going through the voting process, the final voting process, and that will be complete on August 26th. We believe that standard will be complete and then published early this fall and available so that those safety standards will be complete for air conditioning and chillers. Those then need to be adopted into the model codes. For example, ICC and IAPMO, so the model building codes. And then those normal process would be for them to be adopted from that into the states. Now, they could be adopted, the safety standards could be adopted directly into the states' building codes or city building codes, local building codes. However, for 50 states, this is a longer process. And so as we see kind of 50 states moving forward, there will be a lot of work to do to educate people on what's happening and why it's happening and to help them to move forward. However, if we think about one or two states, I think there are ways to move things forward from a code adoption perspective, since the safety standards are nearing completion here this month.
Very good. Next question. does the Kigali Amendment phase down HFOs too?
That's a very good question. HFOs are not controlled substances under the Montreal Protocol, so they will not be phased down under the Kigali Amendment.
Okay. Next question here. You mentioned in California, R401A for stationary AC will not be limited even beyond 2022. Is that correct?
The proposal, all the things that I showed you about California are actually in the proposal stage and they're not final. But the proposal that we saw last October said that 410A would be exempt for servicing. So not for new equipment, but for servicing existing equipment was their thinking at that time. Whether or not they'll stick with that thinking or change what they're doing we remains to be seen, but that was their current thinking last October.
Very good. I think we have one more question. And the question is, what financial incentives exist that will be available to equipment owner for achieving GWP reduction?
That's a great question. In California, there are incentives that are that have been that were included in the legislation that adopted SNAP rules directly. I think it's been earmarked at $1 million right now, so that's what's been funded so far. And they're determining kind of how that will potentially be spent. There is opportunity to go out and advocate for additional funding, not through CARB, not through the California Air Resources Board, but through the political structure there. And so I think that is one way that their intention is for end users and others to gain access to some funding for transition.
Very good. Just going to look and see if we have any other questions coming in. It does not look like we do. So with that, I think we're going to close. Helen, I want to thank you so much for your time in providing the wealth of information that you have on these issues to us. I want to remind folks that the webinar and deck will be available on globalFACT.org. If other questions do come up, please feel free to send them to us. Contact information for myself and for Helen are on the last slide as part of the deck. And if you've not already done so, please feel free to join our email distribution list, like us on Facebook, follow us on LinkedIn and Twitter, as we will continue to provide programming such as today's webinar to folks to better understand issues as they emerge. So with that, I want to thank everyone for your time, and that will be the end of the webinar.
Jordan, thank you very much for having me. And this, I think the questions show how engaged people are. We've had a lot of attendance here, and I think it shows how engaged and concerned and interested people are in the emerging world of changing refrigerant regulations. So thank you again for your time and the opportunity to do this.
Absolutely. Thank you, everyone.